Welcome to everyone for this very exciting seminar where she's going to present stuff from her latest book. It's called Properties of Rent, Community, Capital and Politics in Globalising Delhi. Looks like a great book. It's just come out this year, 2022, with Cambridge University Press. Sushmita Pati is faculty in political science at the National Law School of India University in Bangalore. She studied political science at Delhi University and JNU. She's interested in studying the intersection of urban politics and political economy. Today's crowd is a bunch of PhD students, research assistants, people who will also just about, like he's about to start his PhD in different walks of life. Right? So it's but across very interdisciplinary, working with all sorts of disciplines. At IIMA we have about 10 disciplines: standard, marketing, finance, economics, but we also have public systems, which is a workforce and so on. Organizational behavior. I think some students from organizational behavior are also interested in this particular idea. So over to you. Take how much of your time you want. We have Q&A at the end. So about 40 minutes.
I'll take around
40 minutes.
That sounds good.
20 minutes of Q&A. All right. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chinmay, for putting this together. Also, Rashmi, for making all of this very, very comfortable. And frankly speaking, I am very surprised, pleasantly surprised to see so many of you turn up. I was suspecting that it will just be me and Chinmay chit-chatting with each other, but I'm very glad to see that that's not the case, and that so many of you showed up. Like Chinmay says, this is a part of my book that has just come out, and this was my PhD thesis, which has now become a book. So now that I see that a lot of you are into PhD, I'll also tell you the PhD story of how this actually came about and how I fumbled my way through this idea. Right? Yeah, so that's the book. So I'll just keep this in the background. And so what I do in this book is that I trace Delhi's economic life. And a lot is known about Delhi's trading histories, about its business communities, and now increasingly the role it plays in startup capital. Like most cities, Delhi too is made up of a mosaic of these different economic circuits and their institutions and actors crisscrossing each other. This book looks a little differently at the story of its economic life. It asks if Delhi's geographical expansion has anything to do with at least a part of its economic relations and networks. So again, to be honest, this book, when it is shaping up as a PhD proposal, this part about the economic aspect wasn't quite there. I was interested, like most PhD students, I was fumbling for a topic, what to do, what would be the topic that would hold your interest for, God, I'm 5 years, right, at least. So that was my major struggle. So I was at that time interested in urban forms, and I was interested in looking at these curious spaces in cities which don't particularly fall into a specific category, right? So slums had been written about, of course these gated communities had been written about. So I thought one good way of looking at a new form of urban phenomenon would be, in Delhi, would be this thing called the urban village, right? So to begin with, this urban village phenomenon is a little peculiar to Delhi. A few more cities have it, but by and large, many as cities are growing and the rural parts are coming into urban fold, we see similar kinds of forms cropping up in almost all cities. So villages becoming a part of the city is the story of urbanization broadly. And the urban village form that we are looking at is these villages used to be in the southern fringe of Delhi's outskirts. So in 1950s, when Delhi becomes independent, India becomes independent, Delhi is now the capital of a post-colonial nation. The partition refugee influx is also the strongest in Delhi. It is now the seat of power. So as a result, there is a lot of demand for land, right? And that Delhi needs to grow. Delhi at this point, those of you familiar by and large with Delhi's geography, would probably end around somewhere what is called Karol Bagh. Now Karol Bagh today is central Delhi, right? It's not any part of the fringe. It's an older settlement. It very much be a part of central Delhi today. And so this is where the southern expansion of Delhi begins, post 1950s in Delhi, right? So, and again, remember that this is also the time of Nehru's big modernist dreams. He had very gigantic, massive plans for India's development, of which cities were a part. Chandigarh is one example of this. So the fact that cities need to be big and planned and ordered and new, so the new part of New Delhi is imagined through this interesting document called the Master Plan of Delhi 1962. Those of you who are interested in urban planning, the Master Plan of 1962 is a marvel to look at, because it is not an urban plan, it is actually a regional plan. It wasn't imagined as a city plan. So the imagination of modern planners was that megalomaniac at this point, that they thought that they would actually comprehensively plan all of national capital region. And of course, this is also the time when massive land acquisition is taking place from these villages which used to be there on the southern fringe. And these villages used to be either were either Jat or Gujar villages, right? These are two agrarian pastoral communities which populate quite a significant part of the northwest part of India, largely. So, so what happens in this land acquisition, interestingly, is that most land acquisition programs that we see or we have witnessed in this country, it's an in toto acquisition. So the government acquires land and people are dispossessed and they're given some compensation money and they're resettled, right? Or not resettled. Here, what happens is that their agricultural lands are acquired, but the residential lands are left alone, right? For reasons that are not known, probably they were in a hurry to acquire land, probably they didn't want the headache of resettling people. So what they did was they acquired the agricultural land but let the residential part of the village be. So as a result, what happens is that as Delhi is growing and growing rather fast in 1960s, right, with offices coming up, with residential government quarters coming up, with institutions like Indian Institute of Technology and Jawaharlal Nehru University coming up. These are all massive projects which which needed a lot of land, right? I wouldn't say needed, but yeah, they were given a lot of land. Maybe that's another way of putting it, right? So automatically what's happening is that in this modernist land project, as much as land is acquired, there is also a simultaneous land scarcity being produced, because you are putting in that kind of defense kind of land into, say, big projects, right, big massive projects. So so that's largely the backdrop. So what's happening is that yeah, I just want this to be for a bit. So, yeah. So what's happening in 1950s and 60s is that these villages are coming into the middle of what the city is, right? So the big roads coming up and big government quarters coming up, and these villages are somewhat getting squished in that development project. So if you look at this map, this is towards the central and the southern side of Delhi's map, and I've mapped out all these villages along with a few markers of the city. So you would see India Gate and Diplomatic Enclave, Jor Bagh, the Hyatt Regency and the Maurya Sheraton. These are the big massive hotels and markers of landmarks of New Delhi. But you also see Mahipalpur, Dhulsiras, Dwarka, Palam, Masudabad, Najafgarh, Andheriya Mode, Tughlakabad. These are all villages which are slowly coming into the urban frame. Mahipalpur is very close to the airport, so that's another very interesting story of how that village is transforms with the coming up of airport in the 1970s. Right? So yeah, so that's the backdrop that I needed to set up to tell this story. So basically, this period of land acquisition also coincides with the period of Nehruvian command economy, the period we all know as license permit Raj, the period of intense regulations and limits over industries and trades that came to be berated for red tapeism by 1990s. One of the most important aspects of the license permit Raj was the Essential Commodities Act. Essential Commodities Act 1955 put limits on sale of several commodities it thought were essential to protect the consumers from exploitative traders. But as we all know, all it led to was a steady black market that was even more exploitative for all these commodities. At present, there are only 7 odd commodities that the state considers essential. But in the 1960s, coal and cement too were under heavy permits. And you could not sell coal or cement without getting a permit from the government. And also do remember that this is a time that massive development is taking place, right? So that all these important commodities for construction are under the Essential Commodities Act. But also a time when the Indian state was characterized as rent-seeking, therefore, right? Rent works on a different plane than capital, and this is the major argument of my book, right? When I'm saying that yes, we've looked at city and urban development through the lens of capital quite a lot, but we don't quite know how rent has a role to play, and it always works in a shadowy corner. But what I'm trying to do is throw the spotlight on this idea, this political economic category called rent, and then see, okay, is rent doing something different than what capital would, right? So capital is all about production and creating what we know as value, right? So if you set up a factory, if you produce something that is of importance and you're able to sell it as a commodity, that is the product of capital. Rent is a payment that is derived from ownership. I don't necessarily need to produce something. So if I own land, all I can do is I let someone use it and derive a payment for that usage, right? Today, a lot of scholarship has begun to argue that even software economy, gig economy are also based on rent. Because practically what are you doing? You're creating a resource and you're letting people use it. What is an antivirus or what is the software as a service? But again, a resource that you've created and you're letting people use it. So many new interesting scholarship is coming up which is saying that even this new financial economy is built on the backbone of rent. But that's a different conversation that we don't need to go into right now. In 1950s though, the state had a complete monopoly over prized resources like cement and coal therefore. The Jat villages of Delhi, now bereft of their agricultural land, but with compensation money to spend, begin to look for opportunities to invest in. Right? You're staying in that same place, your agricultural land is gone, what do? And there is a city which is unfolding right in front of your eyes, which has multiple opportunities for you to then plug into. The Delhi Master Plan of 1962 had very ambitious ideas about the Delhi it wanted to create. It is therefore not a coincidence that building material supply became one of the most obvious business choices for several villages. Chirishri Das Gupta and Barbara Harris White discuss how bank nationalization, the newly enacted Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, the Green Revolution, regimes of price control and licensing provided caste groups like the Jats with a new lease of life. In this period, landed castes seem to have used their agricultural surplus to make investments into diverse channels. In urban Delhi, this rent-seeking shaped up very differently. Unlike the Banyas and Punjabi business classes who have counted on their soft skills and business acumen, the Jats entered businesses where rustic masculinity would find more purchase. But interestingly, they were all businesses that required permits and licenses. Coal, cement and transport, all of these were stringently guarded in a city where the demand for these commodities were at an all-time high. With several Jats being employed by the army, one of their retirement perks used to be either a license to sell petrol, coal or cement. As a result, the Jats did begin to populate the fag end of the license permit Raj and earned rents from these protected commodities. But liberalization begins to transform that nature of control. So as license permit Raj begins to fade away, it begins to crumble away, things begin to transform by the 1990s. And which is why we see transport have a very different story than say coal. Coal is a very important commodity in the 1960s. Everyone needs it because LPG isn't quite there yet, and the demand is generally quite high. But transport in Delhi has a very different story because it picks up by the 1990s and 2000s. Public transport was again a dire need in Delhi. And it was broadly under the control of Delhi Transport Corporation. But several Jat landlords ran private transport companies which leased buses to schools for weddings and pilgrimages as early as 1950s. So these would be the kind of buses that many villagers would own. They would own a fleet of maybe 10, 15, 20, depending on how big you were, buses. And these were the Chevrolet buses, which they were very, very proud of. And they would run it and they would apply it for schools and such. But by 1990s, the landscape of the public transport system in Delhi had begun to change. The Delhi Transport Corporation, which ran its own buses, had already started giving out permits to private players on a per kilometer basis. Soon the regulations were loosened up further. Two huge strikes by DTC employees in 1998 and 1992 over the fourth pay commission led the DTC to formalize the red line buses in 1992. Red line buses and later blue line buses were entirely privately run. This is what the blue line buses were. Those of you were in Delhi at any point in time in the 2000s would have seen these buses. Red line and later blue line buses were entirely privately run. Red line buses provided a unique opportunity to villagers in the 1990s. While earlier the transport businesses could only be owned by families or people with big capital, right? You needed at least 10 buses or 15 buses to run a private transport company. But here, all you needed to do was to get that permit to run maybe 2 buses, or maybe 1 bus, or 3 buses, depending on your capacity, right? So what it did was it opened up the possibility of rent seeking to far more number of people than it was available before, right? So that's what it does. The opportunity of being able to get these license and permits was opened up to more and more families than they were before. Though the transport business peaked and ebbed rather quickly, by 2000 they were running into massive losses and court cases because of rising accidents. Probably many of you are aware of these killer bus thing that many of them were getting into a lot of accidents and such. What this period of deregulation ushered in was some skewed form of democratization. If earlier only a few families could get the license to sell petrol or coal, with buses, more families and individuals could aspire to do so. Post 2000s again, as in this is a continuation of the same story, but this time as the bus, the whole transport business kind of crumbles, a new kind of opportunity crops up, which is that of real estate, right? Which is that of your, again going back to this prime property that Jats and Gujars as in have historically built their social relations on, which is land. But by 2000, with this new service economy marching in, opportunities around real estate began to explode. So why I'm saying, of course, land was always valuable in Delhi and these villagers were owners of land in Delhi. But what's changing in 1990 is that until now, only the village land never really was valuable, right? Nobody really wanted to live in those villages. But by 1990s, what happens is that the village land itself becomes valuable, because this is a time when the service economy opens up and more people are looking for what is again another scarce commodity, which is affordable housing. And in many cities, this is true for most cities, be it Mumbai, be it Delhi, be it Bangalore, affordable housing is a real scarce commodity, right? So here, what happens is that these villagers then begin to see a new opportunity, that there is a new class of urban migrants who are coming to the city, who cannot live in slums, right, and cannot afford your upper middle class rental housing. They need something that is in between, right? So what they do is, and because these villages are also exempt from building bylaws, that's a longer story that I won't go into now, but as in I can pick that up during the question and answer. They are exempt from building bylaws. They're not technically expected to follow the Delhi government's building bylaws. So as a result, they all begin to break down their houses and erect what is called this new one-room set apartment. So these new kinds of migrants who are coming to work in your McDonald's, who are coming to look prepare for UPSC, who are coming in to say work in, women who are coming to work in spas and restaurants, they all begin to find housing in these villages in what are called these one-room set apartments. So this is, I won't go into specific villages. I look at two villages, which and one focuses on rental housing, another focuses on manufacturing, garment manufacturing. As the economy was liberalized and that manufacturing gave way to service, Delhi witnessed a spate of migration into the city, especially of a class of workers looking for blue-collar jobs, BPOs, restaurants, offices, and so on. So young people, 19, 20, 22 years olds, entering the life of the city, right? But the influx into the city further revealed the nature of the faulty master plan, which never quite made residential space for the working poor. This new precariat class of workers also finds itself without adequate living spaces. It is then that these villagers realize the potential of owning these village land in the middle of the city and decide to break down their older houses to construct buildings that are solely meant for renting it to the new precariat class. And these are largely very jam-packed housing, windows of one house opening up uncomfortably into another. These are lanes which are dark and dingy through the day, and there's always construction happening in some parts. So if you can get a sense of how dingy, how close these villages could possibly be. Okay. This one-room set, which is quite a popular kind of an architectural invention here, can earn the owner a rent between 2,500 to 8,000 rupees. The cheapest are small rooms with shared bathrooms and no kitchen. The rentals on standard one-room sets can anywhere be between 4,500 to 5,500 to 6,000 rupees. So now let me come to the question of organization itself. Like why is, again, when rent becomes an important, and I'm not simply looking at rent as the monthly payment that we make on rental housing. I mean rent as a broader political economic category altogether, right? So Munir and Shaku Jat are both part of a longer territorial consolidation of Jats across the northwest part of India, right? Mainly Delhi, Western Uttar Pradesh and Haryana. Along with the Ahirs, the Jats were considered by British administrators to be one of the best cultivator communities in India. Unsurprisingly, therefore, as a community with a deep historical affinity to land, there are continuities between this affinity and the Jats' contemporary ownership of property. To date, they follow a system of kin villages, and there is no intermarriage between families of the two kin villages. They are also considered a part of the same unit in the hierarchy of Panchayats. And here I am talking about Panchayats, not the usual Panchayats, not the Panchayats within the legislative central language. Panchayats, as we all know, are infamous for honor killings and such in the Uttar Pradesh and Haryana part of the region. But in Delhi, they have a very different life. They do a very specific job of, and that's what I'll come to. Through the system of Panchayats, the Jats were able to historically forge a regional identity that was a result of a more territorial and not simply a communitarian consolidation. The strong community network was further consolidated as the Punjab Land Alienation Act of 1900 forbade the sale of land to communities that were not recognized by the British government as agrarian. So Jat kinship networks, as a consequence, expanded throughout the region. In Delhi district alone, the Jats owned 48% of land in 1912. And as this land acquired higher value, as speculation over land began to rage, the Jats automatically entered the center stage of all the hyperactivity around urban real estate. Notions of bhaichara. Now, bhaichara means brotherhood, but bhaichara is also a land tenure system in northwest part of, like zamindari is in the West Bengal and Bihar, eastern part of the region. Northwest part of the region used to follow this particular kind of land tenure system, which is called bhaichara. And again, I'm not going to the details of that. Yeah. So. Right. So as this bhaichara and the notions of bhaichara institutions like the kunba and the panchayat began to respond to the changing realities of the political economy around land. Though bhaichara is technically speaking a land tenure system, it is also an ethos, it is also a sensibility by which people within this community feel a sense of belongingness to each other. So by 1990s, these social and political organizations began to be strengthened and reinforced through the real estate boom. The flow of speculative income owing to their control over land in this region, big and small, begins to create new political and social formations. Though the ones who are more affluent are the ones who have been able to make the most, the average Jat villagers with some village land has also been able to capitalize on this boom by simply extracting rent from these migrants. So here, what happens is that this panchayat, which is bound by this notion of bhaichara, begins to operate as a sense of the head of the cartel, right? So what it does is that, and any kind of rent would require a certain kind of organization, would require a certain kind of collective decision making, right? Capital, as we know, can depend on individual decision making, but rent, if it is dependent on ownership of a prized resource, and there are several of us who probably own this resource, then it makes sense that these decisions are collected. And then these panchayats become those institutions through which these decisions are then mediated, debated, discussed, and then finally implemented, right? So what's happening at this point is that, and these panchayats are not recognized by the Delhi government or any government for that matter. These are informal institutions which are customary, right? So at this point, by 2000, what happens is that they also begin to, the same panchayat pradhan goes and registers the panchayat as an RWA, as a resident welfare association. So what it does automatically, that it acquires a modern face. It acquires a face where it has some recognition in the legal institutional parlance of modern governance. But on the inside, it continues to work quite like the panchayat, where women were not allowed to vote, tenants of course couldn't be a part of the decision making, and the sense of community and communities' notions of belonging to each other also prevailed very, very strongly. So that's why, like in places like Muneka, for instance, in the village that I talk about, the RW doubles up as a traditional panchayat and the modern rational institution, and shows the malleability and the precise form of modernity that these villages and institutions therein inhabit. Eventually, panchayats or RWs in Muneka emerge as an economic cartel or an association of landlords. Cartels are the final stage of development of monopoly capital, which is possible only after a high degree of centralization. As the one-room sects began to proliferate through the village as units of renting out, the property units also begin to lend themselves to a higher degree of standardization. So if you have a standard commodity, right, where my commodity is not different from yours, it only makes sense to then form a cartel and sell it together. If OPEC does it with oil, these villages probably do the same, something similar with something like housing. Now let me come to the kunba. Now kunba is, those of you who belong to North India would know that it's a family unit, and a kunba could go up to maybe 3 generations of a family's extension, right? So it could include your second cousins and so on and so forth. And the bigger the kunba is, the more stronger your own position can also be, depending on these situations. So Shahpur Jat, again, is not very far from the previous village, but they're all around within like 5-10 kilometers of each other. It develops very, very differently because it comes into the urban frame much later. It starts getting urbanized and developed only as late as late 1970s. And for some reason, the karigars who worked on garment began to somehow converge in these places and started to find living spaces there. So as a result, it automatically and organically led way to a garment manufacturing kind of an industry. So Shahpur Jat's innards are full of these old style houses with large rooms and crumbling wooden beams and doors, places like these. Right? These spacious, elongated rooms in old-fashioned houses now function as addas or karkhanas. Karkhanas are small workshops for different kinds of garment work. Addas are specific kinds of workshops that specialize in embroidery. So there are men, you would see 6 men who would sit on these frames, right, and work on those frames for 10 hours, 12 hours. And when the day job gets over, they lift that frame up and then they roll down the mattress. They have their cooking utensils in the corner. They cook there and then they probably retire. And then in the next day morning, they again begin at probably 8 o'clock in the morning. Right. So as a result, we see that these urban villages absorb 2 important things that were overlooked by the Delhi Master Plan: cheap, affordable living spaces for the poor and the precariat, and manufacturing spaces that are no longer factories but small workshops. Right? So while the workshops that run inside the belly of Shahpur Jat resemble ill-maintained standard airless coops, the ushering in of fancy boutiques has changed the landscape there quite significantly. So while the manufacturing, these garment workshops are inside the village, on the outer the fringes of the village have developed into these fancy boutiques and fashion designers, and so NIFT is very close by, so just you pass out and then you find a space somewhere and you start operating there. And this place is very, very busy during Delhi wedding season, because that is where all the lehengas and the wedding clothes are often being made. So this is the kind of economy that this inhabits. But it is also a part of the global garment chain. It's not just catering to the local Delhi needs, but it's also a part of the global garment commodity chains as well. Yeah, so here what you see that because this a very different kind of investment and capital has started to come in, unlike the case in Monica in the previous village, Shahpur Jat has a definite need of gentrification of that particular property. So then it is not enough to just gentrify your own property. It makes sense to then gentrify an entire stretch of property. And often because these village lands were owned as families, so often it so happens that it's an entire family or maybe two families which own property in that particular stretch. So what happens is that families then begin to invest money together. They pool money, they collect a sort of a kind of a lump sum amount, and they pull it back into upgrading that space. So you would see lanes which have cobblestones, which have pretty lights and so on and such, because that's the way in which they're trying to attract a particular kind of clientele which would be looking out for those kinds of gentrified property, right? So Chaudhry Baliram, and I won't go into the story as such, who is a powerful landlord from Shahpur Jat, reconstructed his large homestead to build havelis for his 5 sons, probably around the 1970s. Today, his sons and grandsons are owners of this stretch of property. Though this endeavor was individual to begin with, at some point the family realized that the collective upkeep of this property would fetch them far higher rents. Lalita is the daughter-in-law of the same family. Her husband had first started to rent part of the property to a leather factory coming up in their premises. She vividly remembers how many in the family looked down upon them for renting out their property. But after her husband's premature death in an accident, she took on the mantle and began to handle the rental business. She speaks of her struggle and her determination to make the business work all by herself before other members of the family also joined the bandwagon. Soon, the 5 havelis, which have a private back lane running between the house, began to realize the potential of the rental market. Now, there are 2 young grandsons of the same Chaudhry Baliram, who talk about how difficult it is to keep the entire family together. Mired in jealousies, ego clashes and conflicts, these kunbas seem fragile at times. 2 young grandsons of Chaudhry Baliram, after having experimented with different kinds of businesses, have now come around to managing their collective property. They speak of having worked hard to begin a somewhat fragmented and quarreling family together by making people talk to each other. Despite all the internal fractures as an economic unit, the kunba is working quite successfully. The family makes joint contributions to social functions and festivals to appear as a single institution. So they put up a common front, they put up a singular face also for the broader village. Ownership and rent-seeking stakes, though professionalized, become the mode of accumulation. The kunba adopts and closely resembles the form of a joint stock company in order to function as an economic unit so that it can generate profits for all stakeholders. But unlike a regular joint stock company, control over membership is crucial. At no point this membership becomes immediate. At no point can it become anonymous. In a regular joint stock company, ownership is by and large it's amorphous, it is anonymous. You buy stocks one day, you sell it the next day, and nobody asks a question, right? And that's the point of it. That's the point of stocks and shares. But here, there is ownership, but then it's very closely guarded as to who's going to be the part of that kind of an institution. So just to conclude, the hallmark of these localized institutions, be it the RWA, Panchayat or the kunba, is that they are elastic. And yet, they remain committed to the core value that comes with rent, that is strong control. This does not mean that institutions or the members have remained the same as they did in colonial India. These institutions have been subjected to change and conflict constantly. The nature of rent changes from the period of licensed Raj to now, and probably that this is why they have emerged as a successful institution of economic control in contemporary times as well. Rent continues to inflict its own sense of organization. its own sense of violence and its own set of institutions, social and economic. I won't go into these details here, but I hope as I was able to show you a complex picture of a city's transformation along with that of its economy and its people. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks a lot for that. Open to questions. Feel free. Just raise your hand and ask. Yeah.
Thank you. It's very fascinating. I'm just trying to understand in some ways how this fits into maybe other stories or other narratives that are also there and maybe other literature as well. So one of the things that was, you mentioned that these villages were not governed by the Delhi bylaws as far as sort of housing and all that goes. So is this a story where, because you don't have formal regulations being backed by the state, you have, like, in a sense, what's his name, Asim plus Prakash. Like, I mean, you have these caste-based networks which actually do this act of regulation. That's one question that I have. The other part is, when we talk about cartels, and typically the question also arises, why do they stay together? Like, why don't, so you outline incentives, but there's always an incentive to also to free like break apart. And, right, so how does that act here? And maybe that's the part where you were concluded with saying this, these institutions of violence, etc. Is that what's keeping them together, or something else keeping them together? Besides the economic incentive of sort of saying, hey, we could do better together, but then there's always incentive for free ride or something.
Should I take this?
Yeah.
Okay. So those are two very fascinating questions, and I spend a lot of time sort of unpacking both these aspects in the book. The question on state, right? So that's precisely the context of it. That when the planners were so busy thinking about the big master plan and the big regional development of Delhi, they didn't really have the mind space to think about these small little villages. So as a result, what they do is they say, these villages predated the plan, and therefore they shouldn't be bound by the building bylaws and these modern. But I think they sort of didn't foresee what was going to come. Right? Eventually, what happens is that these villages over 40, 50 years, they grow in the shadows of the plan, right? Completely unregulated, completely not seen by the state. But it's around 2000s when something is happening, and the big churn is also around real estate is also happening. And that's when the government, the state suddenly turns its face. And then begins this contest of the state wanting to say, oh no, some regularization needs to be there. They need to follow some laws. Oh, we will bring in this circular, and the villages are constantly resisting it. Because the one way in which, and that's the interesting thing about rent, right? It can, it only works when there is one single authority. When there are competing authorities, if the state really enters through regularization and through tax and through other kinds of rules and regulations, they know that their power is going to get weakened. So this is something that I speak of this conflict in the book. That constantly there is this. The state is trying to bring in one circular and one regulation, and the villagers are sort of countering it. So in 2011, what happens is that the DDA releases a new circular, says that, the exemption, remember that we gave you in 1962, that never really existed, because it is only meant for rural villages and not urban villages. So automatically what it does, it in one stroke, it marks all these villages as unauthorized then, right? Because those exemptions were never meant for them, right? But interestingly, these villagers have also never demanded regularization. You would hear a lot of clamor for regularization from unauthorized colonies in Delhi. In fact, it is a huge electoral issue, right? the current government was forced to give some regularization to some places. But in their demands, you would never see the demand for regularization ever come up. And I'm saying that's happening for precisely this reason. So, so that's one. About the competition bit, of course, there is. It's not a hunky-dory story of everyone cooperating. Of course, there are bitter feuds, especially around each time when the land values grow up, suddenly start exploding. It happened in 1960s once when the city started growing, expanding quite massively, and the second time around 1990s, right, when the village land starts to become valuable. And that's the time when a lot of land grab begins to happen. Because in colonial, that's the interesting bit about these transitions from colonial to post-colonial. In colonial India, only the agricultural land was mapped on revenue records. Village land is never mapped out because it's not considered to be property as such, right? It's customarily understood that this is my land or this is my cow shed and that is my neighbor's. That land is never taxable used to be never taxable in the colonial regime. So it was never really mapped out. And so because there are no clear property regimes in these village spaces, automatically it makes space for land grabs the moment land value shoots up. So of course in those moments there was a lot of conflict, a lot of family feuds, a lot of neighbors fighting with each other, a lot of internal violence as well. But eventually it begins to calm down, eventually it begins to tense. And Panchayat plays a great role in mediations, in trying to negotiate between two feuding parties, and then that becomes the organizing principle. The major competition happens in elections now. So that's something I talk about in the last chapter, because when it comes to rent, yes, it's fine, but rent doesn't quite give a sense of individual it doesn't let you stand apart, right? But that's what the ones who have really made money and are so-called wealthy and rich are now investing their money in politics, because that's the arena of competition where they can set themselves apart from the others, right? So that's really the arena of competition now.
Yeah.
So actually, building on this discussion, so one of the stakeholders in this ecosystem will be the tenants.
Okay.
So yeah, so I can actually go back to my college days when I used to live in a PG. And so the landowner, so he did not have any other livelihood. He was only getting this income from rent. But as a student, I lived there for a very short period of time. But since we know that factory workers are living here, so maybe they are living for a longer period of time. So what is their role or their take on, like you mentioned that RWA is coming. So it's kind of a formal or a semi-formal kind of an institution. So is there a backlash from the tenants' side, or are they organizing or institutionalizing and demanding their rights and things like that?
So thank you for that question. So this is this is again one of those major struggles during writing your PhD as to should you get into this question or not, because by this time it became very clear that I need to understand how this community works together, right? By picking up the migrant question, it would have been making a choice about getting into their life worlds also, right? Understanding, because there is not one migrant, there are several kinds of, there are migrant workers, there are students, there are migrants from Northeast, there are migrants from Africa, there are migrants from Uttar Pradesh and all kinds of places, right? And everyone comes with very different kinds of sensibilities. So that's why I realized that I will let the migrant question be and not. But there are the kind of conflicts you're talking about. I do cover some of it, especially when it comes to the violence against northeastern communities. And I'm sure you may probably remember that in around 2014, 2015, there were several cases of violence specifically against northeast young men, and many of them were happening in these villages. And I was doing my fieldwork at that time, so I could not look at this. So what's happening is also interesting. So because at the same time as this kind of an economic boom has given rise to a sort of income and business and money, but it has also led to a certain kind of a sense of loss, a certain sense of corruption, that other people are coming in and living here and therefore corrupting us or corrupting our culture. And especially in a village like Munirka, where around 70% of your tenants are from the northeast, who come from a very different culture, who are mostly young, right? It's around like 2022, many of them who are students, have a very different outlook towards life, and which constantly keeps chafing at the villagers. So what I talk about in one of these chapters is that there is always a palpable threat of violence, and never, it may become violence in these specific cases, but never quite does. But what this palpable sense of violence does, which always hangs in the air, right, that it can happen to you, right? What it does is it makes extraction easier. So if your landlord says that you pay up 1,500 extra from tomorrow onwards or next month onwards, you pay up, right? Because you know that you can be at the receiving end of this violence, right? But on the other hand, because these tenants who are also from, say, northeast, have also stayed for longer periods, they've also begun to now organize themselves, and these are also young kids, and many of them very quite hot-headed in many ways. So what happens is that it does sometimes end up in these gang fights and group skirmishes. But ultimately what's the question is that here, but this is not a regular story, I'm saying this is a one-off story because of this particular kind of. The strength of the rent also lies in not letting other people organize. So if you look at the Shahpur Jat, where you have a lot of different kinds of businesses, right? The one thing that the landlords make sure is that the commercial businessmen, right, or these fashion designers or entrepreneurs, they don't organize by themselves. So that's something that they are very that they know this, derive this strength from the other community, not necessarily organized.
So I'm curious to know how these crowded residential communities quickly transform into very posh marketplaces. Now, in the case of Shahpur Jat, of course, there's the benefit of supply of these small workshops. But the others, like horse cars and Megajan Marg in Modi Road, they're not connected to any form of supply, as far as I know. And then they also are very homogeneous in nature. So how do these evolve? Is the decision made by the Panchayats that this is the kind of marketplaces that need to come up here, or are they just responding to demand from a very similar set of traders? That's my first question. My second is a more trivial one. So I've heard stories from old timers in Delhi that the plan was being made. There were these villages that were marked with a red string, and which is why and they were just left out of the plan. Why did that happen? Is that a true story? Why did that happen? Why were these villages left out?
So I'll start with the second question first. The Lal Dora is precisely what I'm telling you. In the revenue records itself, it was the agricultural land was, as opposed to the residential land, was marked by a red line, which meant that the agricultural land is what is valued, is what gets taxes for the colonial government, but the residential village doesn't. And this red line then becomes the defining line of the urban frontier. Right? Because it's only the land outside the red line that gets acquired by the government in the first go. And the land that is inside is left behind. And which is why these are also called Lal Dora villages for precisely the same reason. So which is why, as in this red line is nothing but a way of understanding an urban frontier which is interfacing the rural, right? And what happens to this interface? And that's the story that I was trying to tell you about how these villages really transform. So again, different villages have different stories, but ultimately what's happening is that a certain kind of opportunity crops up in a specific area, and the village economy suddenly begins to give in to that. So if you look at Mahipalpur, which is very close to the airport, you saw it on the map also. It has led to growth of very cheap, small-time hotels, right? So all kinds of hotels, it's lined with all kinds of hotels, right? There's no reason for everyone to build a hotel there, but somehow it so happened that because of its proximity to the airport, then collectively they decided to, everyone just built on that kind of market. If you look at Ghitorni, which is closer to Gurgaon, that's a village which is only for godowns. So it's just warehouses and godowns for different companies. So if you need a godown in Delhi, where do? You go to Ghitorni, right? So those kinds of specializations have sort of emerged for specific reasons. But then the stories of these villages will be very different. If you look at Hoskas, it's a fantastic story of how Hoskas becomes this niche boutique area. Beena Ramani, I don't know how many of you know her name. She's a very well-known Delhi socialite, Delhi and Bombay socialite. Her daughter is you may have heard of Malini Ramani. Is probably her name came up a lot during the Jessica Lal murder case because it was in her restaurant. So it was she who somehow finds Hoskas village and finds this into like a pretty nice place with a historical tomb and so on. It's a lake, and she speaks with the Panchayat, with the Sarpanch, takes him into confidence and says that, let me make this into this niche curated space. And she handpicks designers and businessmen to that space, and it was entirely word of mouth for the first few years. But of course, people also realize that there's something happening here. The villagers realize that there is a market here. Why are we not doing it? And then, of course, the market opens up, and then Hoskas becomes explodes, and those of you who don't know Hoskas, and it bursts open in post-90s time with all kinds of pubs, restaurants, curio shops, artifacts, and now it's very, very expensive real estate in Delhi, right? Despite being completely unregulated, and it's a place which is prone to extreme fire hazards. But despite that, it's become this posh commercial space for this reason.
So it's kind of evidence of the shared decision making of the panchayats that these markets turn out to be specialized.
But also conflict, right? So it's also people realize that, hey, if the other person is doing it, why should I follow someone else's dictate? And why I can just approach 5 people and get someone to come, right? And that's precisely, so then it spawns into a different kind of a story of both individual aspirations as well as collective decisions. So it's a bit of both. I wouldn't say it's either this or that. But eventually rent becomes powerful only through that aspect of collectivity.
Okay, any last questions? Okay, make your questions very quick. We have about 5-10 minutes max. But let's short questions and short answers. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask this. So the post-colonial state takes a regulatory form, which
which is what the appropriating of that to these communities is what we're talking about. But it also has a parallel development role in the same space. So because these institutions are founded on caste, patriarchy, in some sense they would also be evolving, right? The state, because of the repeated interventions of the state in terms of improving women's lives in the periphery of the urban, how does that affect the cohesiveness of these institutions of their own? So there would be challenges to patriarchy within, right? I mean, in some sense there is.
Yeah. Okay. So of course, and what I understood was the challenges to patriarchy were mostly from not from the state,
Yeah.
but largely from just the fact that
Yeah.
young girls are now growing
Right.
in the city, right? They're no longer a part of. So those tensions are definitely there, right? And these women by no means are not assertive. They are fairly assertive,
Right.
but at the same time, they also know that they are controlled, and they have very little way outside that control as well. So it's again, it's a tussle. I wouldn't say it is necessarily one way or the other. The other thing was that, and this is something I talk about in the book, despite being a woman, and that's what many field workers will tell you, that it's the easiest to access other women, right? In my case, it wasn't the case, because precisely of the proximity that being a JNU student, as in there was also a particular kind of preconceived notion about who I am and what therefore what kind of a person I could possibly be. So as in young women were definitely off limits for me as well. So I could barely speak to very few. So that story is something that I have a broad sense of, so you can see the tussle, but it's not a resolved one.
Yeah, so one of the things which I understood was the cartel's power or the community's power came from like owning this means of production, that is the land itself, right? But the thing is that what happens when you try to kind of sell it? So in that case, do you sell it to the members of your own community? And if you mean by your own community, is it like within the Gujjar community or within the Jat community or outside? Can a Jat kind of sell his land to a Gujjar, or is it more kind of more restrictive? That is, you have to sell your property to the members of your own extended family itself. So how does that work?
So thanks for that. It's again wasn't a very easy question to find out in reading the film work. But what I saw was that, of course, the first preference is to not let it go outside your networks, right? And the community would largely want everyone to sell only to people who they know networks. But again, similar tensions crop up. So there are people who would refuse to, if you're getting better offers from people who are not from the village, then you would end up selling to people who are not particularly within those networks.
So there are no punishment strategies at place in those
Sorry?
cases? There are no punishment strategies at place?
Not really, because this is also not, even things like excommunication and such don't quite work in an urban space. They work very well in a rural space. So that's why what happens then is that the cartel therefore is expanded. So this is also something, the cartel is no longer just a Jat institution. The cartel then has to include Dalits of the village. It has to give space to people who were tenants before, but now have bought property in 10 years and 15 years and 20 years. So then it has to expand and make space for everyone. And despite the fact that it remains a controlling body, it also becomes a space for those negotiations and those conflicts.
Okay, last situation.
I was curious to know about your data collection journey, in the sense like what were the kind of sources you used, how you approached them.
So much of it was just ethnographic. I would go and I would catch whoever, and I would ask them to just tell me their story of how do they remember the village and what do they, and then they tell you as to what they see, how they saw the space itself transform, right? And through their individual stories, I sort of began to plot as to how things have changed at specific periods, what happened in 60s, what happened in 70s. That took me back to archives. That took me back to, okay, so what was happening during land acquisition? So then I dug up those land acquisition documents and I saw, okay, what kind of conflicts were happening around land acquisition as such. The period around, again, license permit Raj, that took me to secondary literature around license permit Raj to then understand, okay, what's happening with this regime of licenses, permits, and these new kinds of businesses like transport and cement. What is ACC doing, for example, Associated Chapter of Cement, right? So what are these specific organizations really up to at this point? So it was a lot of, I started though with people's stories, and then I used those plot points to then launch into the broader story of India's political economy. What's happening in India's political economy and what's happening in Delhi city space. And I think what you see in the book is somewhere it's trying to weave these three narratives together. India's political economy, individual stories of these figures and characters I met, and the third being Delhi itself transitioning and transforming at a rapid pace.
Just one. So the ethnography was essentially based out of two villages.
Yes.
Sorry, so last question here, and then we're all going to have food and tea outside, and you can continue to have conversations. So last question.
So wouldn't you think that like looking at the social and economic mobility of these two class groups, the 1962 master plan actually enabled them for that, like looking at their the three divisions that you sort of mentioned, starting from the rental economy that was happening in the early 1962. That was also a time when the first layer of deurbanization was happening in the main cities. Then the buses, when all these places, the villages, so-called peri-urban areas, were getting connected, and they sort of fringed to that. And now the real estate and contemporary time, now it's the politics, you would say. Don't you think it would be like more crucial, like 1962 men played a pivotal role for these two class groups in terms of their mobility, rather than the other way around?
So yeah, that is, it's a catch-22 situation, and I wouldn't. So that's the. I'm not saying these business and these opportunities haven't been there, right? And that these communities haven't made the most of it. They have, right? But at the same time, what has happened is that they've also been cloistered in these spaces, and they have also not been a part of the broader developmental story of India. Right? So they have, like I said, they've been at the fringes of rent-seeking of the Indian state, and they have remained by and large there. Of course, there are stories of fantastic wealth and all of that, but it is this space that they have made the most of it. They have had their upward mobility, but at the same time, they do hold the state in eyes of suspicion, right? Because I don't know if that makes sense.
More from the perspective of the master plan, but yeah, I think.
Yes, for example, look at schools. So these were when Delhi schools were cropping up. These kids who were growing up in these villages would be going to schools, but and this is not there in the book, but it's something I know. These kids would often be derided and mocked and made fun of for being from these villages, right? So they're always an other to that story of India's or Delhi's development, so to speak. They're not quite the South Delhi kids, despite the fact that they are from there. They are more South Delhi than